You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Well, a few weeks ago, my daughter was watching television downstairs, and I was curious what she was watching, so I walked downstairs, and she's watching this documentary series, like a mini-series, I think it was, on the Indian Ocean tsunami from 2004. How many people remember that? Yeah, if you were alive at that time, it's kind of hard not to. That was this earthquake that struck off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, and it was about a 9.1 to 9.3 on the Richter scale, one of the biggest earthquakes ever recorded, and it unleashed a tsunami with 100-foot waves. And it washed over 14 different countries that are around the Indian Ocean and killed over 230,000 people. And it's just wild. It's one of the deadliest natural disasters ever recorded in human history since we've started recording these things. It displaced 1.7 million people permanently from their homes. And I remember, there are all sorts of things in our lives that can trigger sort of a spiritual crisis or an existential crisis or whatever you want to call it. But for me, for whatever reason, I was newly married that summer. This happened on December 26th. So I was newly married. Life was going pretty good. And I just contrasted my situation, my scenario, all the good things in my life with what was going on, all this despair that was unfolding on the other side of the world. And for whatever reason, it kind of sent my faith into a bit of a tailspin. It sent my faith into a bit of a tailspin. And, just these things happen. Events like that can kind of trigger that. Has that ever happened to any of you, right? Another time that happened was a few years before that. And I've told this story a number of times in my life. I was 18 years old. I just graduated from high school. And my brother Jeff, who was 6 years older than me, was living in Alberta at the time. And they discovered a brain aneurysm deep in his brainstem. And so we flew down. We were living in the Arctic at the time. We flew down. And within 2 weeks, it would take 2 weeks of dealing with this aneurysm. He was in the U of A hospital before he gave up the ghost and died. And I wrote a journal of that whole ordeal. I remember every day we were in the hospital, and it was just like this roller coaster of hope and despair, Like, oh, maybe things are going to get better. Well, they didn't. And I remember thinking at the end of that, like, weird that, you got, this is my prayer to God or my question to God. Why did you allow us to go through those 2 weeks of hope and despair, only to kind of, have Jeff die in the end? And up to that point in my life, I was 18 years old. Up to that point, life made a lot of sense, right? God made a lot of sense. He worked a certain way. And it was this sort of dependable, sort of reliable, like I can expect God to be like this. And he always sort of seemed to come through. And I could watch tragedy unfold, like the tsunami a couple years later. I could watch stuff like that unfold on TV. And it was very different because that was out there, that was over there. But then when it happens to you, it's like, well, wait a second. Now things are getting real here, God. I don't understand what's going on. And so again, my faith kind of went into a tailspin. And I started wondering how to make sense of any of this. A couple years back, many of you will remember this, a member of our own church community here was a good friend of many of ours. He was a father of 5, a happily married husband. He was a drywaller, and he was drywalling one day in the basement, and I don't remember what happened. He tripped and fell, and he hit his head on the basement, and then he spent the better part, over a year sitting at St. Joseph's Hospital here, with this potential to recover and yet not. And so there's like this whole sort of uncertainty. And through this, I think it's safe to say, I think through this church family, this community, into sort of a collective spiritual crisis, right? Like, how do we make sense of those kinds of questions? And those are tough days and weeks, especially, of course, for the family, but also for us as a church, because God works a certain way, and then all of a sudden he doesn't. And I know that many of us years later are still sort of like trying to piece that together and make sense of that. And so maybe it's, watching thousands of people die on the news in a natural disaster, or maybe it's, losing a job, or watching a relative or close friend, die senselessly. Maybe it's a stillborn child. Maybe it's a loved one caught in the grip of addiction. Maybe it's watching needless suffering of the innocents in the war in Ukraine right now, or in Gaza, as we see these things unfold. Starvation happening in Gaza this week. A photo came on my screen, and I was like, oh, it just ripped my heart apart. Whatever it is, we have all experienced this thing called suffering, either firsthand or we've witnessed it in someone else. And if you haven't experienced it firsthand, I hate to be a Debbie Downer this morning, but truth is you will experience it at one point or another in this world, in this life. We're going to look at the book of Job this morning, but there is this verse, there's this one phrase that he says in chapter 5, I think, that captures this. He says, "Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward." It's like, oh, such poetic beauty there. In other words, suffering is not an option for us. It's part of the deal, right? And Jesus, of course, reiterated this in John 16 when he said, "In this world, you will have trouble." Like, just accept it. Jesus was brutally honest about the reality of suffering in this world. Nobody denies this part of our existence as human, as part of the human condition. The Bible teaches this over and over, and more than that, our own experience suggests that as well. Suffering is a part of the human condition, is it not? Now, trying to sort out the why of suffering is not very difficult if you do not hold to an all-powerful, loving, personal God who created the universe, who set it in motion, and then who continues to care and to protect his creation as a mother hen protects her young. Like, if that's not the belief structure you hold, the worldview you cling to, then this question of why can really only be answered with, well, why not, right? And so as tough as it may be to accept, it's not that difficult to reconcile. You might not like it, but you're like, well, there's nothing else there, so why wouldn't this be the reality we experience? Why wouldn't suffering be a part of this life? The world is random. There's no rhyme or reason or expectation for things to be a certain way, so why not? One of my favorite lines from one of my favorite singers is Josh Ritter, and he sings a song called "Thin Blue Flame," which is, I know my buddy Matt, it's one of his favorite songs as well. And this is what he says. I'm going to actually let him sing it.
If God's up there, he's in a cold, dark room. The heavenly hosts are just the cold, dark moons. He bent down and made the world in 7 days. And ever since he's been walking away.
So if God is like that, if he's just been, he made the world, and ever since he's just been walking away, and or maybe he doesn't even exist at all, if that's your worldview, then there should be no expectation of anything other, right? There's not goodness, there's not badness, there just is. It just is. And we move on, and we try to scrounge up whatever meaning we can scrounge up and make the most of it, whatever. But this is not the worldview that I hold. This is not my belief system. And I think for most of us in this room, because you're sitting in a church, I don't think this is the view that you hold either. which then presents a problem, doesn't it? And this problem can be posed this way. How do we rectify a loving, caring, personal, and all-powerful God with the very real reality of pain and suffering in our world? Let me see a show of hands. Have you ever struggled with a variation of this question in your life? Okay, a few of us have. Good. I think most of us at one time or another has probably been confronted with this question. Maybe just in passing. Maybe it plagues us every day, right? Perhaps our inability to sufficiently address or answer this question has caused people in your life, or even yourself at one time or another, to have a faith crisis. Similar to what I had when I stood watching this 2004 tsunami on the news, just senselessly take the lives of 230,000 people. There was a study, and it goes back a couple years, 2011, which doesn't seem like that far if you're my age, but 2011 was actually 14 years ago. But I don't think the data has changed at all. There was a study called Explaining Deconversion from Christianity. It was published in the Journal of Religion and Society, and this is what it found, that, did I get that? 32% of those who have left the faith cited the problem of evil and suffering in light of a loving and just God as a significant factor in their decision to leave the faith. So fully a third of people who have left the faith have done so as the significant reason for doing so is because they could not reconcile the evil and the suffering they experienced in their lives and they witnessed in this world with what they believed about God being a loving and just and all-powerful God. So this is not just a problem for the few of us in this church. This is a problem for all of us as a body of believers, as Christians, who hold to these certain attributes of what God is like to try to reconcile this. And there's a word that we use. It is this word, theodicy. Theodicy. And not The Odyssey, which was a Focus on the Family radio series. How many of you grew up with that? Okay, all of us, many of us, good. This is not The Odyssey, this is Theodicy. Everyone say Theodicy. All right, good. Theodicy is a branch within the wider topic of theology and philosophy that attempts to establish the plausible coexistence of three seemingly contrary elements. And these three contrary elements, this gets a little bit heady here, but bear with me. So theodicy seeks to reconcile, one, the existence of evil, such as suffering as a potential threat to or reason for doubting the existence of and character of God, with an affirmation of the goodness and or love of God, and an affirmation of the power of God, including the ability of God to control all circumstances. Don't worry if you can't wrap your head around this. This is a better way of saying it. Theodicy is the attempt to explain how a good and all-powerful God can coexist with the reality of evil and suffering in this world. And so, friends, for the next bunch of Sundays, I don't know how many yet, but for the next bunch of Sundays, we are going to address this question head on in some way, shape, or form, which is a tall order, I fully realize. Now, like I said, this is often a topic that is discussed in philosophy and theology lectures and classes and stuff, and that's because it is a heady and a complex topic. But we are not in a philosophy or a theology lecture, are we? We are in a sermon. And I think the purpose of a sermon, and maybe you agree or disagree with this, is not, or whatever, is fine. But I think the purpose, first of all, is, yes, to learn. But more importantly, the purpose of preaching on Sunday mornings is to draw us deeper into communion with God through his Son, Jesus. That's our objective. Every single Sunday morning that I speak here, every Sunday that we have anyone speak here, that's what I'm hoping we're doing, is drawing us as a community, as individuals, into greater communion with our Father through his Son, Jesus. And so with that said, I would love for us, as we explore this topic of theodicy, to approach it less from a philosophical or theological standpoint and more from a pastoral or a discipleship standpoint, okay? But saying that, I also realize that this can conveniently allow us to kind of sidestep the very thorny topic of addressing the question of, evil and suffering with a loving God altogether. So we want to do both, which is, again, it's a tall order. And that's why I've asked my friend Corey Hoogstein, who's not here this morning, but Corey Hoogstein, many of you will know, is a smart dude. And he is going to come along next week and the week after, and he's going to help teach this series on Theodicy. And Corey has shared with me that his hope in his two messages to talk about three different things. First, that Theodicy is primarily a relational problem more than a logical issue. I'm going to talk a little bit about that this morning as well. Secondly, that suffering comes as a result of loving. Suffering, of course, is an important part of understanding Theodicy. It's half of the equation. And so Corey is going to take us into exploring that topic. And then third, and I have no idea what this means, but it sounds brilliant, touching on chaos and order in relation to trauma, which is the life of the Christian. And so he will explain all of that stuff. Again, so this is somewhat heady, it's somewhat kind of intellectual, maybe you think that we're going back into university and philosophy classes. But I've asked Corey, and I know he'll do this, that he will bring whatever he teaches in the next 2 weeks with a pastoral lens and a heart to, again, draw us closer into communion with Jesus. And then my hope will be to kind of supplement this teaching over the following weeks, talking about all things Theodicy and suffering and other stuff. And I'm not exactly sure what that'll look like yet. So that's what is coming up, though. Does that sound good, everyone? Cool. Okay, well, so that's all by way of introduction to this series. So now we know what we're all on the same page. We're all starting to understand what we're getting into. It's heavier stuff, but I promise our next series will be light, fluffy stuff, because that's what we love to do here. Just kidding. Well, no, I mean, it won't always be heavy stuff, but I feel like sometimes it's important that we enter these waters, yeah? Okay. So I grew up in the church. I grew up in the CRC, the church. I grew up in a Baptist church. I grew up in Pentecostal. I went to the Anglican. When we lived in the Bahamas, I attended a Plymouth Brethren church for a number of years. I was in an evangelical free church for a couple of years. I've been to many flavors of Protestant churches over the years. In fact, Catholic as well. My dad's side of the family is Catholic. But my point is, I have never heard, or anytime I have heard a message or teaching on this topic of theodicy, it has always been in the context of apologetics. How many people know what apologetics are? Some of us? Okay, apologetics is sort of a branch of theology, maybe. I don't really even think it's theology, but maybe it's a branch of, let's say theology, that is concerned primarily for offering a defense of the Christian faith. So providing a rationale, a logic, an argument as to why Christianity is true. And so anytime I've heard messages on theodicy, they've been kind of around this topic. And so there was this idea that there existed a perfectly rational explanation of why a loving God would permit atrocious evil that would lead to untold suffering to persist in this world. And all we had to do was make that sort of intellectual assent to that rationale, and then we could, use that argument against the Christopher Hitchens and the Richard Dawkins of the world and all those who hate God. And we could argue and win them to Jesus. That was the argument. But the problem was, and I think you'll probably agree with this, but I'm curious. The problem was that, as I watched my television set in 2004 and beheld 230,000 people drowning from a natural disaster, or as I stood by my brother's bedside in the ICU as he drew his last breath on his 24th birthday, no less. Or, as we as a family, a church family, waited in vain for our friend, husband, his father of 5, to recover from a head injury, that the greatest, the most solid rationale, the best explanation to address this question of evil and suffering with a loving God just didn't hold water. Or maybe putting it a better way, it just didn't matter. Have you felt that? Have you found that in your experience of suffering? That honestly, it's great, to have an explanation, and we're going to explore those things. But at the end of the day, that's not what's going to bring the most comfort or the most peace, which is what we're seeking in those moments of suffering and grief and despair. I read the book of Job in 2 settings this past week, and I have never done that before. It's 42 chapters long. It's a long book. It's one of the oldest books in the Old Testament, and it's written 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, this book was written. And I encourage you, if you have the time or the ability or the space, read this book of Job as we're going through this series. Take the time to do this, because this is just, it's a brilliant book. And Job is written in sort of poetic prose. So think of like Macbeth or Homer's Odyssey. Again, we're talking about Theodicy. Don't get confused by that. Or Paradise Lost. And so it's like this long poem that tells a story. And so because it's a poem that tells a story, we read it as poetry. We don't read it as history necessarily, right? We read it with symbolism and metaphor, and we read the book, with the right lens that we apply to it. And that's, I think, the reason that it was done that way is because the topic that Job is addressing it's too deep. It's too complicated, too complex to just use straightforward language to kind of access, to get at the truthiness of it. And so I think Job utilizes metaphor and symbol and all these things to help us access truth, which, just as a pause, makes me think that oftentimes we need to employ poetry and art and song to get at some of the deepest truths of our reality. Isn't that true? And I think this question of theodicy, this question of suffering with a loving God, is one of those things that maybe the best way to access, the best way to tap into it is through poetry. So I think that it was very intentional as to why Job did this, or whoever wrote the book of Job used poetry to do so. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. But it does reveal that this book, this is 3,000 years old, and this book Job serves as a microcosm. His personal story of suffering serves as a microcosm that can be applied to all of us on sort of a grand level to say, like, this is what our story is of suffering, and we're trying to make sense of it. And so, think about that. This was a problem that they were dealing with 3,000 years ago when this book was written. This question of evil and suffering with a loving God is not new to you and I as sort of this, cynical 21st century world where it's fashionable to doubt and question everything. No, these are the ancient cries that humans have been echoing for thousands of years, which should cause us to have pause about this question. We are not going to solve this in the space of a couple of weeks. This is not going to be something. So just kind of don't, set your expectations accordingly. But let me summarize the book really quickly as a way of introduction to the series. Job was a man of integrity. He was upright. He was blameless. He was righteous in the sense that he feared God. He turned away from evil. He was the kind of guy you would point to and say, if you want to figure out how to live life and do it well, look at Job, right? Like, that's the kind of guy Job was. And Job had all sorts of riches. He was super rich. He had lots of kids. He had lots of servants, lots of livestock, all the things of that ancient Near East world that would have been important and valuable and given you sort of a good life. And so all's well. And then something weird happens. God says to Satan, yes, that Satan, he says to Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? This is in chapter 1, verse 8. Have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God, stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You've always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You've made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out, take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. So we're not going to get into that. But that sets up the story for what is about to happen to the person of Job, or this person Job. And so all of this conversation, all that happens here is, of course, unbeknownst to Job. He has no clue what happens behind the curtain, right? He has no idea that this is the kind of dialogue happening between God and Satan about him. And so what we see in the next 2 chapters of the book is Job's possessions taken, gone. His children, they all die. His health, gone. And, maybe most of all, his understanding or his expectation of how God was supposed to work, completely shattered, right? Everything was taken from him. And so he sits there in the dust. He's scraping his wounds with broken pottery in pain. And then we see 3 friends that come on the scene. And they just sit with him at first in silence. Because really, what else are you going to do? You're beholding this pathetic, sad human who's just lost everything. And I think they have nothing else but silence, right? And that lasts a couple of days. And then from chapters 3, so again, there's 42 chapters in this book. From chapters 3 through 31, so 28 chapters, we basically get a dialogue between Job and his 3 friends. And again, this is fascinating stuff, and I encourage you to read it. It's brilliant. It's beautiful poetry. It holds up after 3,000 years. And what does that dialogue consist of? Essentially, these friends are looking to make sense of Job's suffering. They don't know what's going on either. They don't have any access to the conversation between God and Satan. All they have is what they see in front of them and their own experience. And so they search for a rationale because in their world, as in Job's, as in ours, life is supposed to happen a certain way. A plus B equals C. That's how the world works, right? God is like this, so that means your suffering must be because of this. And so they start spewing out reasons for his suffering. Well, Job, it's because you sinned, right? Maybe God is testing you. Maybe this is a punishment. Maybe if you just confess something, all of this would go away. There's 28 chapters of this kind of blaming Job, blaming the circumstance. Because they have to have a reason for why this is happening to Job, their friend. Essentially, what those 3 friends are doing are presenting theodicies, different theodicies that they are offering up to Job to help him understand what's going on here. And if you've read Job, you know that his 3 friends are completely wrong, right? And they get rebuked. In fact, at the end of the book, chapter 42, God turns to Eliphaz, one of the friends, and he says this, I am angry with you and your 2 friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. You've got it all wrong. None of what you said, those 28 chapters, it's all wrong, right? So what did they get wrong? Well, throughout their speeches, again, 28 chapters, we're not going to read any of it this morning, but throughout their speeches, Job's friends do this. They claim to speak for God, and yet they completely misrepresent him. They're quick to offer oversimplified explanations for Job's suffering. Oh, it's because you sinned, right? That's simple. Stop sinning. And Job didn't sin. He was totally innocent, and he kept claiming that all the way through. They weren't listening to that. They prioritized defending God over comforting Job. And finally, they failed to reflect humility or compassion that God desires in all of us. Now, what does God say about Job? Well, he commends him. Even though Job also challenges and questions God along the way, and even though Job objectively gets it wrong, and we know he gets it wrong, because he says things about God doing this to him, when you and I as the readers know what's really going on here, right? We've got the first chapter of Job that tells us the conversation between Satan and God. Here's an example of what Job says. This is chapter 16. 12 through 14. He says, all was well with me, but he shattered me. He's talking about God. God shattered me. He seized me by the neck. He crushed me. He has made me his target. His archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. Again and again, he bursts upon me. He rushes at me like a warrior. So Job depicts God as this violent attacker, like a warrior hunting him down, breaking him apart. He accuses God of making him a target, of piercing him without pity, right? Of rushing at him like a violent enemy. But does God do any of that? No, that's not God who does any of that. God's not the one doing that. So why does God give Job a break and yet deal with his buddies so harshly? Well, it's not because Job has actually been right in his assessment of the situation. He was wrong. But I think, and this is my personal opinion, and I think this is held by a number of scholars as well, people who are much smarter than me, but I believe God commends Job because Job wrestles honestly with God, doesn't he? He wrestles honestly with God. And Job's plea all the way through this book is coming from a real place of anguish and pain and suffering. He has no choice but to be honest before God and to demand God clarify, explain himself to him. The friends, on the other hand, speak with a theological confidence, yet they lack truth and integrity. There's a certitude there, but there's no compassion. There's no love for Job. There's no empathy, right? All they care about is cold, hard logic. That's what they need. They just need an explanation for this suffering. And so they treat Job's suffering as a logical problem that needs to be solved more than as a human who needs to be comforted. They got it right at the beginning. That silence, right? That silence is just being present with him, but that wore away pretty quickly. So, in other words, it's not the one who protests, who pushes back, who demands answers who is in trouble, but it's the one who tries to defend God with shallow theology and quick answers. God honors those who wrestle with him. And we see this all through the scriptures. We see this, remember, with Jacob, right? Jacob wants to wrestle with God, literally. We see it with Moses. We see it through David. We see it with Jeremiah. You name a Bible character, if they wrestle with God, it seems quite clearly that God will honor that. Over and over. That's the tendency that God has. One of my favorite authors, the late Rachel Held Evans, she said this: God is not looking for people who can spout doctrines verbatim, who have all this theological certainty, or who have all the quick answers to these challenging and complex questions. That's not what God is looking for. God is looking for people who can be real, who can be honest, who can wrestle. Yeah? And that's who Job is. That's who Job is. And so while his friends miss this, Job has no choice but to just be raw and to present himself before God. And God recognizes him for it. Now, there's a whole other part to the book of Job that is fascinating, and it requires more unpacking and more exploring. But for the sake of time, which I'm probably already over, let me just briefly summarize it. So this is chapters 38 through 41. God turns to Job to address him. And what does he say? Right? What does he do? It's beautiful. Job is there. He's asked he's put all these demands on God. How do I make sense of this, God? And God turns to Job and he offers them this beautiful, perfect theodicy, a full explanation of why he's suffering. Right? He gives it to him point by point by point. And then Job walks away satisfied. Is that how the story goes? That he could have. It's interesting. Like, God could have just said, well, here's what's gone on behind the scenes, Job. Satan came up to me and we had this weird conversation. Maybe it wasn't weird, but it was this conversation. And, Satan really didn't think you were going to be faithful to me. And so he could have had this whole explanation to Job, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he turns to Job and he does this. He asks questions of Job, rhetorical questions. He begins in chapter 38, brace yourself like a man. Sit up. Pay attention. I'm going to ask you some questions, and now it's your turn to answer me. This is what God says to Job. And then he asks him 77 questions where Job is speechless. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Can you guide the constellations in their season? Do you give the horse its strength? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Like all of these questions that Job is just like, I have no idea. He cannot answer these questions intentionally. God asks these questions for a reason. So rather than a perfect theodicy, a perfect explanation of Job's suffering, which we think Job is entitled to, and we think that'll solve the problem for Job. As a reader, we're like, yeah, that's what you should be giving him, God. Come on. Job instead gets a whole bunch of questions about God. And so rather than answers to his questions, what does he offer him? He offers him his presence. His presence. So even though Job doesn't get a response, this is what he says in 42, near the end of the book. He says, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you. Like I had kind of had an idea of what you were like, but now that you've met with me here and you've spoken to me and you've asked all these questions, now I see you. My eyes have seen you. Do you think that Job literally saw God here? No. But it's like, now I get it, right? God has revealed himself to me in a way that I am like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand. Now I see. I think that's more what Job is trying to get at here. And so instead of a neat and tidy theodicy, Job gets the presence of God. And somehow, that's enough. Somehow that's enough. God understands that a full explanation is too much for Job. He can't wrap his head around that. He won't be able to. So instead, he just presents himself to Job, and Job is satisfied with that. Like what a beautiful book of the Bible, right? Like this, it far exceeds my expectations of what ancient literature should be like. It's a brilliant book, and I really encourage you to read it. So quick overview of Job, but where does this leave us as we embark on this multi-week study of theodicy? Should we give up trying to understand this question, accept that it's beyond us? No, not necessarily. But also, it should lead us to begin with a posture of humility, yeah? A posture of humility, and a posture that concedes three things. And this, we'll get closing here. That we are limited. We are limited by our language, by our comprehension, by our finitude. We just do not have access to the things of God. And I know that sounds like a cop-out. But 3,000 years of struggling through this question, right? And we're still struggling through this question. And because as we see with Job and with God, God has this opportunity to spell it out completely. Yet he opts to ask questions that reveal how limited this and incapable of understanding Job truly is. 3,000 years of gaining knowledge as humans. We've really, compared to Job to now, we've really expanded in our understanding and our collective knowledge of science. And a lot of those 77 questions we could legitimately answer today, can't we? Like we know lots of things. Science has helped us a lot. And yet we are no closer to answering this question. How does a loving God rectify all the evil and suffering in this world? A loving and all-powerful God. How can we reconcile that? So that's the first one. The second one is this, and this leads from that the best and the most accurate theodicy that we can come up with is still, at the end of the day, going to be woefully inadequate in alleviating our grief, our suffering, and our pain. This has been my own experience with my journey of suffering in life. And I think I'd venture to guess that for many of you, it's your story as well. And God knows this about Job as well, right? His friends offer their explanations and their suggestions and their solutions, their rationales, but none bring comfort. None bring solace. And even God himself, at the end of the day, does not bring answers. Which leads to the third point. The best solution to suffering will always be presence over position. This is true of us as it is of God. Job's friends, the only theological thing they got right was sitting there in silence with him at the beginning. That was smart. That was wise, just to be present with him. And so their position on the why was mostly wrong. In fact, God transcends all of that and comes to Job, and again, he doesn't give him answers. He doesn't give him a position or a rationale, but he offers his presence, not as a way of sidestepping the question, but to acknowledge the reality of the magnitude of what we as humans are trying to grapple with. This is beyond us. It's too much to comprehend. So instead of forcing certainty, that will fail inevitably to bring comfort and peace. Our greatest offering as followers of Jesus, our greatest offering to the suffering that we experience around us, that we witness around us, is not to offer necessarily a why, a rationale, but it is just to be present with those who suffer. Amen? All right. So let's leave it there for now. I'm going to invite Matt to come up again. But if you are carrying questions and doubts and grief and anger and confusion toward God, toward all of this is a series where you are invited to come and just leave it at the altar as we grapple with this stuff together. As Corey and I teach this stuff over the next couple of weeks, I promise you we will not offer platitudes or bumper stick answers like God's in control, just trust God, or everything happens for a reason. So many other of those things, those platitudes that I think are well-meaning, but they just end up hurting more than helping, right? We're not going to be doing that in this series. We want to be a little bit deeper than that, perhaps. Something more honest that we want to offer you, something more faithful in the way of Jesus. No, we're not going to have all the answers. I'm not promising any of that. But I think maybe if we're like Job, we'll discover that even when the reasons are hidden, God's presence is very real and very comforting. That's my prayer for this series as we begin. Amen.